All right, and welcome to the July 4th Independence Democracy Edition. What are two very overused and common terms that are really hot right now? Can't think of two other than democracy and Web3. But in this episode, going to add some clarity and definition and how Web3 could actually save democracy. Find out in just a second. Welcome to Assembly Unfiltered. I'm your host, Satchel, and co-founder of Assembly, the Learn to Earn platform. Assembly Unfiltered is a podcast about democracy, privacy, blockchain, politics, leadership, company culture, crypto, security, and startups. It's meant for anyone who believes that all of us are living in challenging, turbulent, and even exciting times. We're living in a moment ripe for dramatic change. We envision this as a podcast for our tribe, people who share an interest in how all these threads weave together for better communities. This is meant for our learners, voters, advertisers, civic organizations, tech geeks, developers, and employees. I hope you enjoy this episode of Assembly Unfiltered. All right, we're in the middle of the season of two things, democracy and questions about the validity of Web3. On the anti-Web3 side, we've got a lot of people who are saying, rightly so, that it's just a big, meaningless collection of nothing and associating it with either technologies or with trends such as NFTs. At the same time, kind of in a completely different space, there's a lot of chatter on threats to democracy, particularly because there are hearings going on in the United States about certain activities by different people, and just really questioning whether there's a real democracy here because of this. And we have to save democracy, and a lot of, hand wringing and gnashing of teeth. So, I'm going to propose we bring these two things together by descoping the definitions and really tightening it, and actually propose Web3, rightly done, can participate in saving democracy. So, what do we do with these two very vague terms? So let's start to define them for the purpose of this discussion. So what do I think Web3 technology should enable? So this is not about the specific technologies. Those may change. But what is being enabled by the underlying technology? So one of them is the concept of ownership and making it very visible, auditable, having some form of true economic returns. That hasn't happened before. Most technology really wasn't about people actually owning and increasing their ownership stake or simplifying the means of ownership. Very related to is once you start to have value that can be owned, you start to having to play stakeholder incentives. The reality is, as we have more complicated systems, there are more complicated set of stakeholders. There's customers, partners, users, and various other actors, and being able to reward them or penalize them on reportable, observable, and enforceable behavior really hasn't been possible. And so I think that's really one area of the design space. And one element of that is designing it such that game theory increases security, trust, and growth. And Bitcoin is one of those examples where the game theory just works on multiple levels and timescales and actors. And I think that is just the beginning. Very related to the game theory, which is just sort of a more granular definition, is being able to have transparency and trust. Like the ownership and the incentives and applying game theory, it really requires the ability to have total transparency across what's going on. So in the past, we've seen, transparency is just, I can see the code. But there's a lot more involved, right? So trust of on-chain data and enforcement through smart contracts is a new concept. It's actually taking, there's a code, but it's looking at actual behavior and the economic returns on this behavior. Digital cryptographic signatures and other forms of proof really start to change the game in terms of verifying identities or credibility or proof of some kind of activity. And then the last part, I would say, is definitely fuzzy. It is not the most important thing, but I think it is a natural extension as we go through ownership and stakeholder incentives, which is open community governance. Now, we know that that can get very, very fuzzy, but I think there are some cases where it really does matter that people who actually have a stake can express that stake through determining the actual policy and governing of the platform or the systems. So that's a good segue to democracy, which should at its core have at its center open community governance, meaning there are people who participate, they are encouraged to participate, and that participation is actually acknowledged and executed upon and enforced. Now, before I go in too deep, and I'm not a political science person, but the United States is often lifted up as standing for a democracy, but it technically isn't. It's sort of a representative government. It's a representative democracy. So what does it mean when pundits say, we're seeing threats to our democracy? And I'm not exactly sure, honestly. There are just a lot of headlines that talk about that. And they don't provide the exact context, but I would descope it as the following, taking the guidance from open community governance, which is really the longest view, and it's not even critical to me for Web3. The first one is voter participation is such that it is truly representative of the will of the people. Meaning, if you only have a small segment of the population actually voting, and the people being affected by the policies do not vote, then certainly that's not a form of democracy. The second one is it's not just the act of voting, it's sort of the intent and knowledge. So it's actually meaningful, meaning somebody's vote actually represents the fullest and truest expression of the will of the person. And the person has been fully educated about what's best for themselves in the short term, what's best for their family if they're thinking about long term, if they really are civic minded, what's best for their neighbors or their friends. But even if we just said everyone's a selfish, self-maximizing actor, are they truly educated on what's going to improve their selfish ends? And then the third one is, let's say it is representative, meaning in terms of the actual set of numbers. The second one is, well, those set of numbers actually are meaningful because everyone is knowledgeable and are representing their enlightened self-interest. Then the third one is, well, are the voters able to keep the elected officials accountable to actually do what they ask? Or they're able to vote directly for policy in a credible way, which is probably a truer state of democracy. So that's how I would define these two, Web3 and democracy. So how can Web3 address this problem? I mean, it's guaranteed very thorny and not easy to solve, but I think this scopes it down from a lot of this other sort of hand-wringing. The first of it is, the crux of it is as many people as possible who are engaged in the voter process and educated. I think if we get that, we know, look, they are educated, and we'll define what educated means, and they are fully engaged, meaning they actually go out and vote, then I think that really addresses the nature of democracy. And so that sounds very simple, and it boils down to better civic education experience for every eligible voter. But we know that that's actually not done currently. Right? Certainly not by the schools, and definitely not by the government. Neither of those entities are reliable or effective at civic education. The public policy is just too complicated. And so the onus now falls on the market of those who care about specific outcomes. So those are the campaigns, the advertisers, the advocacy organizations. And so given the fact that we just can't seem to find good education done by governments and schools and even, sort of nonprofits with that, that requirement or that mission, I think when we go into the market, now there's some incentives, and now you're going to have pros and cons, people on both sides of the issues. And that kicks us back to thinking about Web3. And that's something that Web3 is very good at, which is game theory. How do you get both sides, who are potentially even adversarial, to then engage to make a stakeholder in ecosystem vibrant? And Web3 actually will be a way to pioneer the ways those incentives work. And one of those is incentivizing voters to actually learn about the issues and incentivizing campaigns to participate and grow a platform that, in fact, will educate people, but they'll have to acknowledge it's going to expose them potentially to the opposing side. And if those stakeholders aren't comfortable, and I've met a number of people who are active politically, and they can't stomach the idea that somebody else whom they've already convinced will hear an argument on the other side. And this goes back to my episode on dialectic as a source of truth. So that will always be a problem. But I have, on the other hand, also met people who are very much about the truth of saying we will rigorously debate the topic. We want to hear the other side. We want the people that we're reaching to hear the other side, because we believe our issue, when cast under the light of reason, will stand out. And so I think that is a really key part of how Web3, with the proper set of incentives, game theory, even penalties. So we'll get to the penalty side in terms of one big part that people have said, oh, this is why we don't have a democracy, is there's so much misinformation. And that is true. A lot of misinformation can either make people vote the wrong way, cause people to choose not to vote. And I think if you think about what the nature is of Web3, is one of them is having true observability and ways to counteract things that are just not true. So an example is staking mechanisms have been ways of penalizing people who are fraudulent or trying to do something that is not represented by truth as recorded in the blockchain. We can start to do that with the nature of behavior on a shared platform. It's also the same with things like researching into content. We want to be able to trust immutability. Most people have focused on immutability of content, such as things on IPFS, really just in terms of like preventing censorship and thinking that there are governments that are going to take it down. But one of the things that I've seen in the research about Facebook was when researchers really just wanted to look at, well, what is the impact of Facebook on society or politics? Ads were taken down. That was self-censorship. We want to create trust in a system, and Web3 is a powerful way to do that in terms of the content. So this is just a brief primer on how Web3 saves democracy. Big, meaningless words, but when we scope them down around ownership, participation, incentives, and education and engagement on the civic side, I really do think that those two truly do begin to go hand in hand. But tell me what you think. Click on the appropriate link below to participate in our forums and our community to share with me what you think. And thanks again, and until the next time, bye now.